Welcome to Talent Talks, the podcast where your host Dan Maisey dives into hiring's ins and outs. Our goal is to reveal how to attract top talent. Through interviews with leaders in sports, media and entertainment, we explore job search and recruitment trends, offer interview tips and strategies to differentiate yourself and uncover their hiring insights. Whether you're prepping for an interview or interested in hiring trends, Talent Talks is your essential resource. Let's dive in. I am thrilled to welcome Róisín O'Shea, an absolute powerhouse in the gaming, esports and sports sector, to Talent Talk today. Róisín is the Chief Growth and Innovation Officer at Epic Global, a leading agency in gaming and esports. With an impressive career spanning roles at Twitter, StubHub and Fnatic, she has a wealth of experience in building successful partnerships and driving growth. Her achievements include being a nominee for multiple industry awards such as Best Management of a Sportsperson and Rights Holder of the Year. Her background includes managing commercial activities for sports rights holders, consulting on sponsorships, and driving brand activation for major entities in sports and entertainment. So I have a wealth of experience that I can't wait to get into. So, Róisín, welcome to Talent Talks. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to get through this. This is a really interesting topic for me.
Good. Well, let's get straight into it then. So we ask this to every guest that we have on the podcast, as you know, as our starter question. What are your experience of hiring and being hired, and do you have any lessons learned?
Where do I start? So yes, lots of experience of being hired. You'll see, if you check out my LinkedIn page, you'll see I've worked across lots of different companies. I haven't done your typical tenure, long tenure at companies. I've actually jumped around quite a bit. And for me, a lot of that was through my network. So in terms of me being hired and when I've switched jobs, it's been through people I know predominantly. And so I think what that's for me, I've really worked hard to build out my network, because you never know who you're going to meet and how that will translate into potentially a bigger opportunity from where you are. Although I look back at it, and actually at the time it was very subconscious. It wasn't an active thing that I've done, but now it's something I'm really, really proud of, to have built out my network, and that has leaned into some of my career aspirations and made them happen. In terms of hiring, yeah, lots of experience of hiring, predominantly first timers coming out of uni or out of school coming into the sports industry. So lots of relatively junior hires. And for me, that's my favourite, because, I think it's really important that first job you ever have, imagine that it's in sport and you love it or you hate it. I think it's exciting to work in sport in the first place. And for me to be able to, offer opportunities to younger people to come into the industry as their first job, I think it's great. I loved it.
Yeah, I think there's something really rewarding about doing that, because ultimately it is such a passion project for a lot of people. And I know I want to ask a few questions around that, but I want to go back before we do that into the network side of things, which is critical. We both know that there is a sports bubble that we are part of. What's really interesting with what you said around that it was built subconsciously. If you were to go back in time and start again, knowing, or at least starting now as it were, how important for you would it be for it to be much more of an active process of building that network and know what you do then, if you can articulate it, as it was, as you said, subconscious. What did you do then that ultimately you would still do now, or what would you change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, yes, 100%. I would, if I were to go back, I would make it more of an active mission to build out my network, to go to events, to be present, to, join multiple, all the multiple networks that are available to people now, and you'll see them on LinkedIn, you'll see them out there, join them, do that. I would say that, if I go back, 16 years ago, when I first came to the UK working for Unicorn Products, which is a darts manufacturing company and snooker cue manufacturing company and cricket, that job for me, I'd moved from Ireland to London, living in London, but the office was in Kent. And so although I was working in this job in sport and, working very closely with darts players and, the likes and going to events, I was very far removed from the sports world of London. And so I was really keen to be part of that. And so I said yes to things when I was invited. I was introduced to people and I maintained that connection with them. I reached out, I sent them a text, I sent them an email after I met them. But I think I would probably, right now it's so much easier, I think, than it was back then, because, back then LinkedIn, it was there, but it wasn't really as, networky as it is now. So yeah, I think I would probably be more deliberate and consistent in my building out a network.
Yeah. Look, I sometimes find LinkedIn a necessary evil, but it is becoming much more useful and relevant. I think it had come across a bit almost social media based. And there's a lot of stuff on there that is arguably irrelevant in terms of the wider reason that it was first established, but equally, and I say this to junior people coming into sport or people that want to transition into it, the majority of people will say yes, and especially in sport. And what I find is that as long as you're relatively succinct or relatively specific around what that request might be, and not just, look, can we grab a coffee? I mean, I love coffee, but why? You don't really have to ask me if you're going to buy a coffee for me, but anyway, but it's about how you articulate what you want from them and how that can help you. And most people will say yes. And most people will be open to that. And if they're not, well, fundamentally, it's probably not someone you want.
Yeah, just move on to the next. There's plenty of them out there. I will say, although, yes, you're saying like necessary evil, I am a huge fan of LinkedIn, the good, the bad, and everything in the middle. I think it's such an incredible place. You have one of the things I loved about Twitter, for example, when I came upon it, whatever, 15 or 16 years ago, was you have a direct link to somebody who otherwise you would never walk past them in the street. Like, you would never be in the same room as these people. But this is a digital room where you're in their world. And what would you do if you met them in real life? What would you do? What would you say? And use LinkedIn for that. For me, it's a massive, there's a lot of content on it now. Some of it is a bit wishy-washy and a bit cringy and all of that, but I will
apologize for that on my side.
I will take it, because for me, I'm learning so much from it. And also, if not everyone posts, and I think they're nervous about posting and putting stuff out there. And I think a lot of people do use it as a platform to kind of, showcase how amazing they are and how successful they are. But why not? Like, because, especially in sport, right? It's all about the athletes and their success, and they're winning and they're doing this or whatever. We're the people behind those people, and why not talk about what goes on behind the scenes to make that happen? I am a big advocate of people promoting their jobs, what they do, their part to play in that amazing moment you saw and had goosebumps about. Like, I love it. I think it's a really, really great place. And for people, especially coming into the sports world, like, there's no excuse not to try and reach out to somebody. If, like you said, if they don't respond, they don't respond. But I think talk to them like they're human beings and not like you're not a robot, you're a real life person, and there's a reason why you want to do this. Tell them the real reason. Like, tell them you think what they do is amazing, and I would love, like, I'd love to have your job. I've had lots of messages on LinkedIn from people saying, I want to know how you got to where you are. I'm like, have you got 3 weeks? Because it'll take me that long to tell you. Like, I know. But if you were to say something specific about, maybe one of the jobs that I've done or somebody I've worked with in the past, maybe an athlete or whatever it is, that would probably prompt a response quicker than a broad sweeping, how did you get to where you are? I worked really hard. I took pay cuts. I lost my apartment to live with my sister so I could afford to do the travel that I'm like, all of that. But, you know, that's not what you want to hear. You want to hear this really easy and it's great and you just I'll connect you to this person that give you a job.
Yeah. And that you sit around and talk about sport all day.
Yeah, I go on podcasts and I talk about sport and it's amazing.
I think it's, and again, this is a theme that comes up relatively regularly, is ultimately, if you look at it from a job seeker perspective, LinkedIn is, should be, a fundamental piece of the puzzle. Bearing in mind, it's the first port of call for every recruitment agency, for every company that is looking for roles. And whether that is through LinkedIn Jobs or whatever it is, well, if you've got one CV that is totally different because it hasn't been updated in years or whatever, then you're kind of behind the curve a little bit in the LinkedIn game. And I think a lot of it comes down to there has to be an acceptance from a candidate or anyone looking to transition in or get a new job to work hard at that. Someone said before that it's basically a full-time job trying to find a job. And I wouldn't quite go that far because you can put a lot of pressure on yourself as well in doing that. But I think if you really want somebody's help and if you really want to talk to somebody, then it pays dividends massively if you just do a bit of research behind that person, ask the right question, and you don't know what the right question is necessarily. But even if it's, this is my assumption, is this correct? That means you've done a bit of thinking, and equally, kind of come back to the first answer a little bit on the junior hire piece. I think most people find it difficult to articulate what their value really is. And everybody has something to offer. Everybody has value, whether that is, I really want to understand how you did X, Y, and Z because this is my area of interest. And it's not just sport, and I love the sport piece. That's a given because you want to work in sport. But actually, I love the deals that you're doing, the commercialization, the fact that you've managed to put on an Olympic Games, whatever it is, being a bit more specific, doing a bit more research, and then understanding how what you want to do and how your value that you might have got through school, through university, through whatever way that might be, even up to C-suite level, that actually being able to articulate that in a very succinct, and I hate the term, but elevator pitch, that as you said just a minute ago, in terms of if you were to meet them, you wouldn't just go up and go, tell me about your life. You know, you'd be a bit more specific. I mean, you can do, but it'd take a while. When you are looking at and you're hiring for those junior roles and those first people coming in, what is it that you are looking at from them?
I'll tell you what it isn't. I don't want to hear that you played rugby when you were in school, or we had this chat before. Like, you know, yes, it is sport and great that you like, or you used to play, or you like, you know, you like a certain sport. That's amazing. But like, if I'm at Arsenal and you're an Arsenal fan, that doesn't mean that you're higher up the list. Like, in fact, I'd probably put you further down because your view is slightly skewed. I think for especially first timers coming into sport at junior level, for me, I want to see like willingness to learn. You don't know it all. You want to do something. You have a dream of what your job will be within sport, and you understand that this is the first step. That it might not be the job title or the organization that you want to work at, but you know that within sport, like, there is a pathway, and the likelihood is once you're in, you could go anywhere. And I think being open to that and aware that, like, you've got to start somewhere. It doesn't matter where it is. Just get in the door, take the job, do the thing, meet as many people, use it as your networking tool and learn. Just be open to taking on as much as you possibly can, you know, within your role, but also outside of your role. Take time to meet everyone in the business, as many people as you can. Go for coffee. You know, I think understanding that it's not a direct route to the job that you want, but, you know, would you rather do this job or what your friends are doing, which is something really boring and not really worth the conversation on a Friday after, you know, when you talk to your family, when you talk to your friends. For me, my experience has always been, or if you meet somebody for the first time and they say, what do you do? Like, oh my God, what, you know, Phil the Power Taylor, or you worked at the Olympics, or whatever it is. Like, it's so exciting. People are so excited by it, and you should be too, regardless of what it is. Know that, just be open to learning. Consider yourself a sponge, and consider this the first step to like a world of opportunity.
Yeah, I would potentially caveat that with, don't go into a job knowing you're going to leave that in 6 months' time.
No.
Or as a stepping stone. I think it is a mix, and I think it has to be all right. You get out of it what you put in, and if you go into a role whereby you know that it's not where you want to go longer term in terms of whatever it might be, then that can be a bit dangerous in terms of, well, ultimately in terms of effort.
Yeah. Well, I think as well, it's not necessarily, it might be the organization you want to work at, but the job title, maybe even the salary doesn't reach your expectations. If this is the org you want to work at, get in the door. Prove your worth, do the job, learn, meet everybody. Make sure everybody there knows your name. Like, do the work within that job. Because it's not, don't be disappointed. Like, if it's truly where you want to be, or you think that's where you want to be, you'll know pretty quickly if it is or not, and work your way up. Do that. And the key to that is taking on those extra, be open to doing more things, especially if it's, you know, if it's an event-based company, like if it's a football club, or if it's, you know, a league or whatever. Use those as opportunities to soak up, like whether it's broadcast, like that's the other thing about like sport organizations now. I mean, they've always been businesses, but they're so much more commercial than they used to be. So you could be an accountant for a Formula One team. Like, you could work in Formula One, but as an accountant, like, just because you studied this and this is where your pathway is, doesn't mean it can't be within sport. And I think there's so many jobs now within sport. Like, there's huge demand still, and there always will be, because it is amazing. But, you know, because it's more commercialized, there is a need for so many more elements to a business, and you could be part of it for your, you know, within sport.
Yeah, and I think that's also, you know, a lesson for those that are transitioning from a different career. And let's look at finance as a perfect example. I think the slight challenge with that is, and it's certainly something that we've been looking at, but it is actually on the organisation, the rights holder, whoever, it's on their side of, if you're looking for an accountant or a finance manager or whatever, do they need 5 years experience in sport? And I had an interesting conversation with somebody a couple of months ago that was put a football club in a quite a good context. Ultimately, a football club is a mini conglomerate in the sense that the amount of different elements there are. So you've got the operational side of things where you're putting on games, with the commercial side of things, both from a delivery and a hospitality and a sponsorship sales perspective, and everything else that comes in.
Like merch, everything. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Banking, finance, everything, you know, how the NFL and Tottenham deal came about. All of those different types of things. And then also you have the playing side and all the finance side of stuff that comes with that. And so it's quite a nuanced area, but fundamentally that's not, if you're switched on and you're willing to learn and you have the fundamentals in the area that you want to go into, then there's no reason why that doesn't translate and extrapolate. And I think as an industry, we need to be a bit more open to that. And I think you've mentioned a couple of times in terms of, you know, taking pay cuts, and I have my own opinions on the tax that we have to pay to work in sport. I think I would hope, and I think that this is the case, that it is slowly changing, as you have already said, you know, the kind of increased commercialization of sport. And fundamentally, we have to try and attract the best talent. And by doing that, you kind of need to be able to
pay them. Yeah. I think, you know, I do believe it's, you know, it's not every rights holder, every company within sport, but, you know, there's such a huge responsibility now to deliver. You know, if you look at you know, even in the last 6 months, the investor announcements across sport has been huge. Like, the investment in sport, clubs, organizations, all of that, it's huge. So they're having to answer to investors now, whereas before it wasn't the case. And so they need to be operating much more professionally than before. And so, the need for delivery of, very good work is there, and the pressure on that is there. And so therefore the talent needs to be good, and they need to be willing to pay, because, you do also get what you pay for. But I do think, especially my experience of younger hires, or at least from an interviewing process, not necessarily people that I've hired, but people that I've interviewed, their expectations are way beyond reality of the situation and their experience. And so I think that also is that's a challenge, I think, for most at the moment.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that's a challenge that's just aligned to the sports industry. And I think there is see grad schemes at banks and even at the consultancies, which don't pay half of what some of the banks do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you kind of say, well, if they're paying that, why should I not be paid that? Why should I not being paid that in sport?
Yeah.
And it is totally different, and it's a totally different lifestyle choice, as it were. But fundamentally as well, it's that, again, it comes down to the work that the candidate is doing prior to those interviews. So what am I looking at? What's the benefits? It's pretty easy to find out nowadays. We can go into the transparency on job descriptions and job adverts and pay and those types of things. But if you go into something with an expectation as a junior that you're going to get 50, 60, 70 grand a year because your mate gets that at Barclays, you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think there is still a little bit of like, well, this is the best job in the world. You should feel privileged to work for our brand, our company, our club, or whatever it is. But, I think there's an element, well, you have to give so much when you work in sport. The reality is, especially if it's live sport, that's weekends. Like, that's when sport happens. So your lifestyle choice that you're making to do this job, you might not be a Tottenham fan, but you're a fan of football and you work at Tottenham. And so that means you've got to be there and sacrifice the social life, the family life, all of that. So, and potentially even on saying Tottenham, but anywhere, potentially even earn less because of it. But I think that's where the passion bit comes in. And in sports, that you asked like, what do you look for? I think that's probably one of the main things that connects me to a candidate, is their passion for not just the sport or the athlete or whatever. I think it's understanding the ecosystem of live sport, for example, whether you work in broadcast, TV, radio, or, even as a journalist, or right through to, I don't know, building the stage or putting, selling the hospitality. Why do these fans come here? It's the same reason you should turn up to work. Because, like, for me, I am driven by that one moment when you're watching any sport where every single person who's watching, whether you're at home watching on TV or you're in the stadium or you're at the court or whatever it is, that one moment, everybody makes the exact same noise. And now all of these people have lives and hurt and pain and misery and stress and health issues and money issues and all of those things. But this thing that just happened brought everybody together and made them all gasp at the same time and feel something that took them away from all of that every day. And I think for me, like, imagine being part of something that delivers that. I love it. I love it so much. And that's what drives me in sport, along with so many other things. But like, that's the goosebumps bit, whether it's crying because your team lost or, or you won or whatever it is. I feel really passionately about being part of something that delivers that.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it. And I think you have to be, obviously go back to the point where you have to love sport regardless, but it's loving that element of it. It's not necessarily the sport that you happen to be working, because if you're a Tottenham fan or an Arsenal fan and you work for those clubs, it's probably going to ruin your experience, because
You're going to hate them.
yeah, all you're doing is going, is that sponsor right? Is that sponsor right? If you're working in operations, even if you go to another ground, you're like, oh, I haven't done that in my
Exactly.
ways.
Changes your view. Yeah, that's funny actually. I can't help, because I've always been the commercial side of things predominantly, and I can't help but watch when I watch sports, especially on TV. I look at the broadcast quality.
Yeah.
I look at the perimeter advertising. I look at if it's an indoor arena, I look at the lighting. I look at the floor. I look at the seating. I look at to see where is the disability seating. Like these things that what's happening on the court or whatever, I don't know. I'm too busy. So it does change your experience of sport, but it does also, for me, one of the things that I wanted to be a Formula One driver when I was young. I wanted to be a lot of things, an Olympian and all that. But Formula One driver, and I was told by my two older brothers, there's no way because you're a girl. That's going to happen. And so, not that deterred me or anything. I'm not a Formula One driver. But imagine if that wasn't part of the conversation, right? And I could have gone down that path if my family came from money or something. I don't know. And there was the opportunities, but maybe my mind would have been, I would have stayed with motorsport a little bit more maybe. And maybe I would have gone down, learn to be a mechanic, or if I was, my first job application to the UK would have been to a Formula One team, because I didn't think about what goes on behind the scenes. Of course they have sponsors. Look at the cars, the decals are all over it. Why didn't I think that I could maybe do something commercial within Formula One? I just didn't. And I think, my eyes are right, now, years later, there's so many jobs within sport like that. You could, I'm aware of all of the things. And I would love for younger people who are, even just thinking about what their uni choices are going to be. I didn't, I did a year of accounting and French in university and I quit. I was like, I can't deal with 7 years before I'm even qualified. I don't want to do that. So I'm not you must go to university. I think it's very great if people do, but I don't think it's to be all and end all. But when you're making your choices, think broader about sport if sport is where you want to go.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes down to the opportunity. It comes down to people talking about the opportunity. It comes back to what we were saying about LinkedIn and chatting about what you're doing behind the scenes of, whatever it is. I mean, terrible example, but Bolt winning a 2012 goal. What were you doing in order to make sure that went off without a hitch? And the more people talk about it, the more it's out there. And equally, you talk about being a Formula One driver and female drivers now, etc. And that is becoming a lot more prevalent and a lot more talked about with various organisations.
Yeah.
And schemes and stuff like that. And I think ultimately we are now in a much better position across the board. And, I'd say this obviously coming from a white male, but even when I transitioned into the sports industry 12, 13 years ago from Accenture, I couldn't afford to live in London on nothing. And, so I knew I'd have to take a pay cut and that's fine. But the amount of conversations I was having where it was, well, you've got to do 6 months unpaid here or an unpaid internship here and there. And so what you're doing is you're then appealing to a very, very small group of people that can afford to do that. And then it's coming back to those at the top now that are having more pressure on them to deliver. Well, actually, I don't know if this is a question, but is there now a swathe of people that got into the industry because they could afford to get into the industry and aren't necessarily the best people, but they just happen to be at that level and they're just going from job to job to job regardless of their...
Well, we know that to be true. We know that because it is the reality. You know, if you look at some of the organizations, you know, especially in places like London, where, yeah, there's a lot of that, unfortunately. But I am, just to say, I'm not a fan of unpaid internships. I think, you know, you should always know your worth at whatever stage of your career. And I think do some research, ask the questions. If you can't see a salary on the job advert, ask what the salary is and be very clear. Also, I think, you know, one of the things, the job that you're applying for doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, your salary is the job that. So when people say, what are your salary expectations? Don't go back with an answer straight away. Ask more about the job. Ask about, well, you know, what are the, in detail, what would I be responsible for? What do I have to deliver? What's the bracket that you have assigned to this job? And I'll tell you, like, if it's something that's suitable to me, because I think people get away with murder with that. I think I think you might have an opinion on this.
Yeah. It's questionable whether we've got time to.
Yeah. Okay.
I think ultimately, I think the more transparent one can be, the better, because you're setting expectations from the very off. I think if a candidate in an interview asks those types of questions, I would be, don't know whether it's an expectation or what, but I would be surprised if the interviewer didn't get a bit offended by it. And not personally, not saying that I would, but just almost like, why are you questioning me? And I've had it recently where someone has been turned down for the next role because they felt he asked too many questions in the interview. And look, we're not questioning the authority here. We're just trying to understand what everything is about. And equally, if you've got a bracket of salary, then what does that bracket entail? If I'm coming in at the very bottom of that salary, why is it at the bottom versus the top? Is it because actually, if I'm looking for maybe somewhere between an account manager and a senior account manager, that's the reason for the bracket. And if you come in as an account manager because you're slightly less experienced, here is the route to get to the senior account manager and that higher salary. I think as long as there's an explanation, but equally, I find the kind of salary expectations question a little bit odd, because what does it really matter what the candidate expects? Because I say that slightly caveated, but ultimately, if you've budgeted for that role, that's not going to go over that budget, especially at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, the pressures that we have from a financial perspective, you're not going to go, well, you know, my expectation is 50 grand. Oh, actually, this bracket only tops out at 40. So, well, why have you just asked me that then? Because
if you had said that first, I might be accommodating to that salary. I'd want to know about benefits. I'd want to know about other things that might help me build up to that 50K. Yeah. Is there a pathway to get to? Like, this is where, I think that salary piece, that transparency from the get-go. And you see more and more of it on LinkedIn now, finally. Yeah. But I think more people should do. I think it would just save so much time. Hiring is a really long thing that nobody has time for, which is why people like you come into it, right? You save us, but at the same time, everyone would be a lot better off if the salary was displayed on the job.
Yeah, no, I can agree more. Now, Róisín, I think there might have to be a part 2 to this conversation, because we are wildly over the time, but I'm conscious of yours. So before we do, I want to make sure that we get to our 3 quick fire questions. Now, I always caveat quick fire with the fact that they're never really been that quick fire, so don't worry about it too much. But we will start with the first one. What is your most frustrating thing about recruitment?
The salaries, the lack of transparency in salaries from the get-go. And probably, I think I'm with that, is regardless of how good, like, let's say if I'm the candidate, regardless of how good I am, you know, and how much I think I'm worth for this job and what I can deliver for this job and how much I can add value to the company, the salary budget is the salary budget. And, you know, sometimes they'll you know, go over or whatever, or they'll add benefits or they'll add certain other perks, but I think that piece where if that was out there from the get-go, I'd be able to make a judgment call. And ultimately, it kind of frustrates me that if I was the right fit and if they could see that, then they might accommodate more or whatever. I think just that salary transparency, but also another key thing is about that communication. Again, to stress the point that like the hiring process is so laborious, it's so long, it's additional to your everyday. And if your everyday is already full as a hiring manager, like it's really challenging. So you don't get to go back to everybody. But communicate that at the beginning. Say that, listen, we really appreciate your application. We hope to get back to people, but the likelihood is we'll only get back to people that we'll move forward with and whatever. Timeframes change. But I think just that communication back to applicants.
Yeah, and the transparency that communication can ensure.
Exactly.
Now, you don't have to name them, but you're more than welcome to. Who has been your best hire and why?
Okay, so probably the one that kind of jumps out is a guy I hired at ISC, a sports consulting agency that I was working with a guy called Nick Robinson. And at the time, it was just the two of us. It was just him, and then I joined him as a commercial arm. And we were looking for interns to help us kind of build, to grow. And the idea was like we'd get some people in, we'd train them up as best as we could. And then the ones that we could feel that we could actually develop, we'd keep them. So we did paid interns and internships, and then went on and hired a few of them. And one of them, Ollie, he was very clear from the beginning what he wanted to do. I think he just had an understanding of what the industry and what we did. And when he came on, he was going to be doing some commercial stuff. That's what he was kind of came on to do. But eventually ended up actually doing more like football agenting with Nick, and that was not what he signed up to do, and actually it was really, really tough job to do, especially starting out. And so it was scouting, it was a lot of like trying to make friends with some of the younger guys, and anyway, he did it. He did that job even though it wasn't what he signed up to do, and he did really, really well actually. And then he did go on to join another a sponsorship kind of delivery agency, and he's doing really, really well. And we bump into each other every so often, and I'm just glad that I gave him the shot, because he was very clear on what he wanted to do, and he's ended up at a really great, strong agency doing really cool stuff, working across Champions League and all sorts of different things. And he's really enjoying it. And I think just his passion and willing to learn the space with no real kind of, I don't know, he didn't have the air of expectation. And that was really, and he's also just a really cool guy. So
great answer. Okay, then the final thing from me, Róisín. What is the one thing that you would change about the recruitment world?
I would change, it's not necessarily the recruitment world, but people's views of jobs in sport, and it's mostly to women and girls. There is no reason why you can't do the job that you see other people doing. There is absolutely no reason. In fact, if you can't see the job you want to do, go make it, go do it and find it. Talk to people, put yourself in front of people, reach out to people on LinkedIn, and don't accept that you apply for a job, you didn't get even an email back. Keep applying for that company, that job, other jobs like it. You will find a way. Forget the typical, if you haven't got 80% of the skills on the job description, don't apply for it. Apply for it, because I can guarantee you there'll be some guy who'll have applied for it with 0% of the job description requirements. So just apply for every job and keep going and don't give up.
That is the perfect place to end it. So, Róisín, thank you very much for coming on Talent Talk. It's been very much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.